Okay, we have Dr. Roger Sanders here, and maybe you just tell a little background of who you are.
Okay, I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Origins Research at Bryan College, which is basically set up to help develop creation models or creation hypotheses, or hypotheses of science that go along with a literal interpretation of the biblical history of about 6,000 years for the Earth. So as a young Earth creationist, I would disagree with the basic underlying tenets or presuppositions of the deep time biological evolution. Rather, we would, as a creation biologist, I would want to rather take scientific evidence and interpret it to see if it can be interpreted in a scientifically sound way to actually mesh with a history of the Earth of about 6,000 years, that in a way that it would actually be consistent with the young Earth position of a biblical worldview.
What time would you put Noah's flood?
Okay, so for example, with Noah's flood, the biblical time frame, depending on whether you use the Masoretic text or one of the other texts, was about 1,650 years after creation, or about 4,350 years ago. Now, the problem is with the radiometric dating that places millions of years in the picture. When those dates are interpreted in a young Earth setting, the time of the flood, actually let's say the end of the flood, those rocks that are laid down at that time, in conventional thinking, are about 65 million years old, when in fact, as a young Earth creationist, we would interpret those as only 4,300 years, or 4,400 years old. So there's 70 million years of radiometric dates that basically have to be squeezed into a bit over 4,400 years.
What about like the Egyptian records that go back over 5,000 years old past the flood?
Okay, I know that there are archaeologists actually that are creation oriented that are working on resolving those things. And so part of those dates may, if they are based on carbon-14 dating, those carbon-14 dates also have to be reevaluated and adjusted. Also, some of those dates may be due to possible misinterpretations of the length of rains and that sort of thing.
Okay. What about can all the different species that we see today be formed like the dog in just 4,000 years?
Okay, well, that's one of the things that my group of creation biologists is working on. So this is a group called Barrowmanologists. Barrowman referring to raw, created, and mean kind. That's a term that was coined in the 1940s for created kind. Basically, the study is to try to determine how many species are in a created kind, and for things like mammals, if we can understand how many species are in a created kind, then we basically know how many have diversified from a common ancestor that was on the ark. So in that case, I think for dogs there are probably, counting the fossil dogs that were fossilized after the flood, it's probably, I think, over 100 species. So that's a challenge for creation biologists to understand how that could happen. But
would you say they all came like from a wolf, or there's a number of different ones?
The modern dog breeds apparently all came from the wolf, but there are more species of dogs than just the wolf. So you have, let's see, I'm trying to think, the dingo and some African wild dogs and various foxes and such. So these would basically have diverged and formed separate species after the flood from a common ancestor that would probably was not the wolf, but the wolf also came from this common ancestor that was on the ark that we don't really know what it looked like. This group of creation biologists is looking at potential mechanisms, and one thing that's very intriguing is looking at things called jumping genes, or also segments of chromosomes that have been moved around, so that when you compare foxes and dogs, we find that whole sections of chromosomes are moved around and put recombined to make the different chromosomes in the different species. So these sorts of things lend to the idea that after the flood, ecological stress could have very possibly have allowed the genomes, that is the genetic makeup of organisms, to be reconstituted in a very brief time, and that reconstituting or that recombining of these the sections would put those genes in different genetic environments and allow different genes to be expressed in very different ways than they would have been previously. So that's what we're looking at as a potential mechanism for very rapid diversification.
Okay, rapid speciation?
Right, rapid speciation. So we prefer not to call it evolution as such, even though some people may call it microevolution or even lower level macroevolution. But diversification seems to be a better term because it's not based on the same mechanisms that evolution or microevolution is based on.
What would you say would be like the key evidence that the Earth is actually only 6,000 years old?
For me, I think the work of the geologist was very helpful because if you look at the layers of rocks, those that are called Paleozoic and Mesozoic, when you look at the way they are laid down, they cover very extensive areas, whole continents. Sometimes they cover several continents with essentially the same makeup and quite thick layers compared to the layers of rocks higher up. So these rocks, Paleozoic and Mesozoic, are thought by creation geologists to have been the layers that were laid down during the flood. With those layers higher up, those that were laid down after the flood, with extensive volcanic eruptions and such for a number of years after the flood. So the idea that these very extensive layers of the flood rocks is highly inconsistent with the idea of the present, the past can only be understood in terms of the present, or the present explains the past. That is, geologists generally think in terms of looking at present processes and extrapolating back from that to explain the rock layers. However, what we see happening today, we find river deltas depositing fairly thin layers of rocks in fairly localized regions, for example, the Gulf of Mexico from the Mississippi Delta, but you don't have continental or cross-continental areas being laid down today. So that would be a situation that would only be happening in a global catastrophe as described in the biblical flood.
I was just wondering on the different layers here, shouldn't we find like spores and seeds all the way down to the layers and all the way through these different layers, but we don't find these? modern flower plants and other seeds and spores?
Okay, so the creation geologists and creation biologists have looked at that question, and again trying to interpret the scientific data of the fossil record in terms of a biblical time frame. Rather than seeing the rock layers and the fossils in them as being gradual evolutionary changes, they see them instead as biogeographic areas that were inundated sequentially, so that you have only the spores or the fossils of that particular geographic zone or geographic biome encapsulated or into the fossils at that point. And then as the flood moved, or rather as the destruction moved from one geographic zone to another, then new types of plants or animals became entrapped and fossilized. So you get a progression which is not time and evolution, but area and geographic zonation.
I know there's some that say there are dinosaur and human footprints together, especially in Biloxi. I just wonder, do you have any comment on that? Is that true, or?
Well, the creation geologists who are trained in geology have looked at that carefully and have concluded that that is not true, that that's a misinterpretation of some of the actual dinosaur footprints. The ones that look human are actually where dinosaurs were partly suspended in water and only the narrow foot pad was imprinted and not the whole foot. So at this point there's no actual real evidence of humans and dinosaurs being in the same spot at the same time during the flood. What is clear from the biblical text is that dinosaurs were created on day 6. Humans, and so were humans. So they were created at the same time on the earth. But that doesn't mean that they were necessarily living together, because in fact what we find is that dinosaurs and the plants that seem to be associated with dinosaurs were all, from what we can understand from the fossil record, were all in one area of the earth, which we would call that a dinosaur biome, and humans and the food that humans would use and the animals that humans would use, like the mammals, were all in another part of the earth, in another separate biome or geographic area that was not flooded until later.
Okay, I'm just wondering also, there's like a claim how close the chimpanzee and human DNA is, and that there's the chromosomes they claim combined, so we have 2 less chromosomes than the chimpanzee. You have any comment on that?
Dr. Wood, who is the director here, has looked at that question fairly extensively, and his research shows that yes, indeed, chimps and humans are quite similar, and that some of the other creationist research he doesn't really agree with, that continues to suggest that humans and chimps are further apart, or more genetically distant than the conventional science says. Dr. Wood's research shows them to be quite close. So the question, that's the challenge, is really not, how can we show that they're far apart, but rather, if they are that close, to understand why God would create humans and chimps separately, but have that much genetic similarity. The fact that they are similar should not cause us, so to speak, fear the conventional data, because if we look at that data and interpret it carefully, then what we see is that humans, chimps are similar, but other groups of organisms, which are, we think, in separate times, are also similar in that sort of way. So we need to develop a creationist theory of similarity in design, which helps us to understand why God would create in that way and what has done and what he's doing with that. So, rather than trying to simply claim that it's not there. There was something else I was going to say, but I can't remember now.
Any other comments or books or something to recommend?
Yes, Kurt Wise has written a book called, I believe it's called Faith, Faith, Time, and, my mind's gone blank.
It's right over here.
Yeah, it's right over there if you get a picture of it in a minute. There's another book called The New Creationism by Paul Garner. So both of those would be excellent books to get a basic understanding of what the creation biologists and creation geologists have developed in recent years.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.